There comes a point in some people's lives when the fire quietly goes out, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a silent exhale. They stop chasing, not because they no longer care, but because something inside them has grown tired of the endless motion. The late night overthinking, the constant striving, the unreturned effort. It all starts to feel like running on air. From the outside, it looks like they've given up, but inside, it feels more like awakening, realizing that nothing outside ever gave them what they were really chasing for. Some call it laziness, others call it maturity. In truth, it's a deep fatigue mixed with clarity, a strange peace that comes after too many emotional injuries. They stop, not out of defeat, but out of an exhausted kind of wisdom, because they've finally understood that not everything lost is worth pursuing again. When someone stops chasing, it's rarely a spontaneous decision. It's the slow erosion of psychological energy, a gradual collapse that happens beneath the surface. At first, they tell themselves to try harder, to stay disciplined, to keep believing, but each attempt to push forward meets an invisible wall. This is the stage of emotional burnout, when the mind's reward system no longer responds to effort. The brain, once driven by the promise of achievement, stops releasing the dopamine that used to motivate action. What used to feel exciting now feels meaningless. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, when repeated disappointments teach the mind that effort no longer changes outcomes. The person begins to internalize failure, not as something temporary, but as a fundamental truth about themselves or the world. It's not that they can't keep going. It's that they no longer believe it matters. Their nervous system, constantly flooded by stress hormones, starts conserving energy by retreating into numbness. So they stop answering messages, stop trying to prove themselves, stop chasing after affection or recognition. What looks like apathy is often self-preservation, the psyche's last defense against collapse. The body, tired of survival mode, demands rest. The heart, tired of one-sided effort, demands distance. And in that pause, something sacred begins. The first moment of honesty after years of pretending everything is fine. Here lies the paradox. The people who stop chasing are often the ones who once chased the hardest. They were the ones who cared too deeply, tried too sincerely, gave too much. Their exhaustion is not born of indifference, but of intensity. When you burn with purpose for too long, without being met halfway, the fire eventually consumes itself. What remains is not emptiness, but the ashes of meaning. A strange mix of wisdom and weariness. They realize that chasing was never really about the goal itself. It was about proving worth, earning love, or feeling alive through movement. But the longer they ran, the more they mistook motion for progress. And when they finally stopped, they were forced to face the haunting question: who am I when I'm not striving for something? This is the price of awakening, the quiet grief of losing your old self. You used to be the fighter, the dreamer, the believer. Now you're just still. You notice how silence stretches inside you, almost painfully. The phone doesn't ring, and the world doesn't seem to care. You realize how much of your identity was built on pursuit, of goals, people, validation. When the chase ends, so does the illusion of control. And yet, within that void, there's an uncomfortable truth. Stopping doesn't mean peace comes. It means the noise disappears, and all that's left is you. Raw, unfiltered, without the comforting distraction of purpose. You grieve not only what you've lost, but who you were when you believed it was still possible. Some people call it depression, others call it detachment. But beneath both lies something purer. Awareness. You begin to see that chasing was never sustainable, that the hunger itself was the cage. The energy that once fueled ambition now feels misplaced, too precious to waste on things that do not return your effort. You start to look at the world with a slower gaze, questioning the very logic of striving. The paradox deepens. You envy those who still chase, their naivety, their momentum, their faith. Yet a part of you knows they too will tire someday. Because everything we pursue externally eventually asks the same question in return. What are you running from? The price of clarity is loneliness. You no longer belong to the crowd that measures worth by movement. You begin to sense that stopping is not a failure but a passage, a crossing from external validation to inner observation. Still, the in-between hurts. You're no longer who you were, but not yet who you'll become. And in that fragile space, every still moment feels like both a loss and a quiet revolution. Once the chase ends, life slows to a strange kind of silence. Not empty, but vast. You start to notice things you never did before. How the wind sounds when there's no urgency. How the day feels longer when you're not rushing through it. Yet with that stillness comes a haunting question. If I'm no longer chasing, then what is left for me to live for? It's an existential unraveling. For so long, movement equaled meaning. You measured life by progress, achievement, forward motion. To stop is to confront the void that all striving was built to avoid. Philosophers have long called this the crisis of meaning, the point when the illusion of purpose dissolves, and the self is forced to redefine its existence. Psychologically, this is a reorientation of the psyche from doing to being. The ego, which once found identity through struggle, begins to loosen its grip. This is terrifying because the mind equates stillness with death. Yet true consciousness begins there, in the quiet recognition that life's value was never dependent on pursuit, but on presence. In Eastern psychology, this phase mirrors the path of non-attachment. To stop chasing is not to abandon desire, but to observe it without being enslaved by it. You start to see that what you sought was not the object itself, not the career, not the person, not the goal, but the feeling you imagined it would give you: freedom, love, validation, peace. But these were never out there. They were projections of your inner longing. Stillness then becomes a mirror. When you no longer run, you begin to see the machinery of your mind, the endless grasping, the invisible expectations, the childhood fears that told you love must be earned. To stop chasing is to face the silence beneath the noise of ambition. It's where you finally hear your own truth without distortion. This is where psychology meets spirituality. The death of the chaser is also the birth of awareness. When the self ceases to define its worth through outcomes, it begins to perceive life as it is, not as something to conquer, but something to experience. You start realizing that meaning doesn't disappear when the chase ends. It transforms. It becomes less about achieving, more about being with. Some call this awakening. Others call it surrender. But it's not passive. It's active participation in reality without the constant need to control it. You start doing things not because they'll make you someone, but because they express who you already are. Love, work, and creation become offerings, not performances. The still mind no longer runs toward happiness. It recognizes that happiness was always what remained when the running stopped. You start to see that peace is not something you chase. It's what greets you when you finally stop running from yourself. Eventually, after the quiet confusion of stillness, something begins to shift. The exhaustion no longer feels heavy. It starts to feel clean. The pause that once felt like a void begins to resemble space. And in that space, a softer kind of movement returns. Not the frantic chase for recognition or completion, but a gentle curiosity toward life itself. You begin to realize you didn't stop living when you stopped chasing. You simply began living differently. This is the reframing, the point where rest turns into renewal. When you stop running after things, You begin walking toward yourself. The mind, no longer obsessed with control, learns to trust timing. You notice that some things come naturally when you no longer demand them. Relationships deepen not because you chase love, but because you now meet people without needing them to fix your emptiness. Work feels lighter, not because it's easier, but because your worth is no longer attached to the outcome. You start to understand that peace is participation without desperation. You can care deeply without clinging. You can act without proving. You can move forward without chasing. Stopping wasn't an end. It was a recalibration, a turning inward to see which pursuits were truly yours. You no longer run because you found the ground beneath you, so you walk, slowly, intentionally, with presence. You still have dreams, but they're no longer demands. You still love, but it's no longer a transaction. You've learned that not everything needs pursuit. Some things arrive only when you stand still enough to receive them. The psychology of people who stop chasing is not about surrendering to failure, but surrendering the illusion that life must always be pursued. It's about reclaiming energy from exhaustion and redistributing it toward awareness. You stop trying to win at life and start participating in it. And that's the quiet miracle of this transformation. When you stop chasing what you think you need, life begins to meet you where you are. Not because you forced it to, but because, for the first time, you've stopped running away from yourself